to say we're really thrilled to be hosting this session with Chris Johnstone. So very much welcome to Chris, who I'm sure you know is a leading resilience specialist and author of several books around resilience and active hope. So it's a great privilege to have this really special time with Chris together in such a relatively small group to guide us through this territory around building our resilience in these very uncertain times, and particularly how reconnecting with nature can offer us such huge support. So we certainly understand in our Nature Connection project that we're running that there is a kind of epidemic of dislocation with nature, and for many of us it feels modern life doesn't allow us that time to connect with nature. So I hope that you stay with us to the end of this session to hear more about the in-person and the online nature connection opportunities we're going to be offering here in Norfolk, including all these different activities, different diverse things such as ecotherapy, house planting, growing skills, learning to grow crops in pots, forest bathing and walking. So we will hear more about them later, but without any further ado, I'll pass you over to Chris, who will begin to lead us through our 3 Routes to Resilience workshop. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Ruth, and welcome everyone who's come to this. I'm going to share screen, and as we move to that, so this is really our focus, and I love it that those words roots and roots, they have different spelling and different meanings, but there's a kind of way that they kind of weave together. We're looking at rootedness as a pathway to resilience, but also rootedness as in like a 3 roots, 3 different ways that we can build resilience, and skills, relationships and nature. Resilience is a big word. I'm going to say a bit more about what I mean by that, but in terms of emotional resilience, I'm holding the question, what helps us face difficult times and situations? And I'm aware of the larger world situation we're in at the moment, very difficult times on all kinds of levels, but also everything that we talk about you can apply after the kind of bigger picture things, but also just in terms of what's happening in our lives from day to day, holding this other question, what helps us reduce our risk of stress, anxiety and depression? So I'm going to move into talking a bit about how I see resilience, and I use pictures a lot, and here's a picture I'd love to share, and I think this picture expresses a story of resilience. There's a story of resilience in this picture, and what I mean by that is that there's a difficult beginning followed by a response that makes a better next part more likely. And if we just think of that's really what resilience is about. You can have a difficult beginning and then a response to that makes a better next part more likely. And so in this is a picture of a forest that's had a raging wildfire, but there's new growth coming back. And resilience is our ability to deal with, find strengths in and or recover from difficult situations. And something I find very helpful is just to recognize, and particularly when we're talking about Nature Connect, that resilience is a powerful force of nature. You can see it when a forest is burnt down. You can see it when a piece of land grows back after some kind of devastating event, but it also happens in us as well. This kind of, we talk about bounce ability. You see a young toddler learning to walk, they fall down, they get up, they fall down, they get up. And we can have times where we have a dip or an illness or an injury that we recover from too, that there is a natural side to our resilience. And that powerful force of nature, it happens through us, but also there's learned resilience. We can learn ways of helping resilience happen more. And that's really what I'd like to focus on. And one of the ways of learning about resilience is to see it as a story pattern. A story pattern, you can see this shape of downslope and upslope in all kinds of situations where there's a difficult beginning, might seem bleak at the start, and you might think this is a story about, and it might be about you, might be about me, might be about someone you know and you play a role in supporting, but it could also be a community you're part of, or a neighborhood you live in. And resilience, that is really about how we respond to adversity, to challenge, but also then looking at what helps that lead to that better outcome. And I work a lot with what I call the me, you and us model of resilience. So me is what I can do in terms of self-care. Everything that we're going to be looking at in this session, you can apply on a personal basis. But you is where you're helping someone else. There's a you in front of you saying, like, let me help you. You might play a role in caring for a family member or a friend, or somebody using a service, or it might be a colleague. But there's also us as a larger community, society. There's us here, a gathering of people in cyberspace, from Toronto to Norwich. We've got people coming to this webinar, and it may be even more listening to the recording. So whether you're at the live webinar or at the recording, that there's a larger us of people interested in resilience and looking at what happens when we're facing a challenge, what's going to help us. And the central question I ask myself is, whatever I'm facing, I say, what does a story of resilience look like here? So that's what we're going to be exploring. And that story has a downslope and an upslope. And these three routes, I'm going to start with skills, and then I'm going to talk about relationships, and then I'm going to talk about nature. And I think skills, a skill is something that you can learn. And it's also something that you might already have, but you can still get better at. And I think of some important resilience skills I'm going to touch on are self-awareness, just actually recognizing when you're facing a problem. You can get better. There are practices that help self-awareness, but also self-steadying when you're feeling a bit rocky, feeling a bit going through a kind of a bumpy patch. There's ways of steadying yourself. And we're going to be looking at mapping resilience factors as a learnable skill, and also using resilience tools is something that we can become more skillful at. And this self-awareness, if we start with that, if resilience is about what helps us deal with challenge, I use this image of these three zones of challenge as like a check-in tool. And I look at it and I say, how am I doing right now? My green zone is a kind of challenge that I can deal with easily. I'm not outside my comfort zone. And there are some challenges where I can deal with them. They stretch me a bit, but it feels like a manageable stretch. And then there's also times where I am just over an edge into, well, I think of it as the red zone, but it's where I might feel panic or defeat or major threat, overwhelm. It's the kind of really difficult stuff. And there's all kinds of shades of those different colors. So I'm going to invite you to do this right now, just saying, how have I been over the last week? And you might have actually been in all three zones, but this is a check-in tool. This is a starting point. How have I been over the last week? Am I generally feeling that I'm doing okay? I'm kind of managing with this, or do I feel a bit stretched, but it's a kind of a manageable stretch? Or have I been really outside my kind of safe zone, feeling really deeply threatened, major challenges going on at the moment? And just invite you to put those in the chat window. Just how am I doing just right now? And this is your starting point. And the chat window, that's a choice. It's an invitation, and also respect your privacy if you don't want to. But it's often good to just get a sense of, well, how are we doing as a group? You might that might be something that you put in. That's our starting point, is self-awareness and recognizing. But also in relation to resilience, there's something really important here, is that the zone you're in doesn't just depend on how difficult the challenge is. It's also linked to how well you can deal with it. So I'm just seeing quite a lot of orange to red, orangey red. There's some red around, and some orange, some everywhere, quite a lot of orange. And also that may be why you're here, orange and red, on a daily basis. I'm really getting a sense you know the red zone. It's familiar to you. And that's why, from my own experience, it's only from the times I've really been in the red zone that I started getting really interested in resilience. But the good news is that there's very clear research that shows that training in resilience can help us deal with difficult situations in a way that reduces our risk of stress-related harm, reduces our risk of anxiety and depression. And that's based on studies done both with adults and with children in all kinds of settings. And so that's part of our goal. And I would say sometimes a really good way of dealing with a red zone is to step out of it, as actually to have a strategic retreat. But also we can overplay that. If we only do that, then we don't get the confidence of dealing with situations. And so also want to look at this upward arrow here of how do we grow our confidence at dealing with difficult situations with the red zone times. And I want to introduce some more tools. And here's another tool. I call it the spider diagram. And the core idea is whatever you face, there's different ways it can go. Some much better, others much worse. And a question that was developed as part of a big resilience training program in the States, and as the Penn Resilience Program, they have a perspective check where they say, what's the best that can happen? What's the worst that can happen? And also what's most likely to happen? I don't know about you, but sometimes when I'm going through a difficult time, my mind can get rather fixed on the worst that can happen. And I need to remind myself that that's only one of a number of ways that things can go. And so even when things are really deep red, I can say, okay, this is a starting point of a story. What are some of the best ways it could go from here? And what are some of the worst ways it can go from here? It's worth me paying attention to that, not to focus too much of them, but it's a bit like if you have a fire drill, it's worth being aware of the worst things that can happen in a fire. That motivates you to take preventative action. But also to that question, what's most likely, helps orientate you. So, okay, so what's the best that can happen? We're going to be looking at that because I find helpful this idea of even when things have taken a turning for the worse, there's still times where that can work out better ways. And you might have had experience of that, a time where you thought, this is just awful, it's never going to improve, but it did. And remembering those times, remembering of what helped you deal with dips in the past is one of the ways you remind yourself of what might help you in the future. So I love this double spider diagram. When things take a turning for the worse, just remind yourself it can still go different ways. What's the best? What's the worst? What's most likely? But then I like the idea of active hope, as we say, what do we hope for? And how can we be active in making that more likely? So that's our journey with resilience. And this is a skill. This is a skill of, I call it storyboarding. Storyboarding is really having a sense of mapping out some of the different parts of the story of things getting better from here. How might that happen? What are the different elements in a story of resilience? And mostly you can think of it, well, there's something you're facing, and then you're looking for what helps you when you're facing that. And I love these words, acceptance and commitment. In fact, there's a whole approach to therapy based around those two. Acceptance, what happens is what happens. Here's me facing this. But then commitment is about saying, I'm committed to finding a better leg of the spider, of where it can go from here, looking at what helps. And so a skill I want to introduce is mapping resilience factors. And I use this image of rowing along in a little boat, and that's things going well. And then hitting a problem is a bit like your boat crashing into a rock. And it can be very helpful to know about the rocks and to perhaps see people who know about those rocks. That's a useful way forward. But also resilience is more to do with the water level. And you've probably had times where your water level has been low, where you've struggled to cope. You might you can have the same problem that you deal with on 3 different occasions, and one time you deal with it really well, and maybe 1 or 2 times you really struggle with it. And just thinking, what are the things that make it more likely that you'll struggle? I'm going to invite you just to write in the chat window. If you had a sentence that began, I tend to cope less well when, what would your answers be there? I tend to cope less well when. And this is just recognizing, so when I'm hungry, when I'm tired, yeah, so absolutely. When you're tired, and this thing about when you're tired, it's a bit like your water level is at a low ebb, you know, you're depleted. And when the water level's low, you're more likely to crash. So when you have sense of lack of control, too many things going on at once, when you're frustrated, when you're panicking. So what we can do, we can think of these are risk factors. These are risk factors for having a difficult day. But resilience is really about the other side of that, which is saying, okay, what are the times I tend to cope better? If you had another sentence that went, I tend to cope better when. So I'm going to write it in the chat window. I tend to cope better when ... return. And I'm going to invite you to think, okay, what are the times that there might have been a time I really coped well? I thought that was good. You know, I had a difficult weekend and I got through it. What helped me do that? And so you know this one. So when you move your body, when you get good sleep, when you get out for a walk, when you organize, when you plan ahead. So when you meditate. So what I'm already seeing from you as a group is that you are an experienced group with resilient strategies. You have things that raise your water level. And so a skill is kind of a skill, something that you can become more skillful at, you can learn to do better, is mapping them out. So I'm going to invite you to, this is something you can do in your own time, is just get a bit of paper and just ask yourself, say, hey, how's my water level doing? I actually kind of speak to myself and say, hey, Chris, how's my water level doing? And what can I do to nudge it upwards? And what that does is it reminds me to do the things I know will help, but sometimes I can forget to do. So we can build on this more, and just remembering that upward arrows have a buffering effect. You know, each one by itself might not be the thing that makes such a difference, but when you add them together, where they work together, they're the whole is more than the sum of the parts. This is one of the ways that we build our resilience potential. Now, I want to introduce an idea. I call it the natural antidepressant. And the natural antidepressant is something that you do when you're really struggling. It helps you feel less blue. And I think of these 4 groups of upward arrows: strategies, strengths, resources, and insights. And you may be familiar with those letters, SSRI, often associated with the tablet form of antidepressants. But there's also research shows that actions we take and choices we make can also have antidepressant effects. And so think of it as a toolkit, and you've already identified a lot of the things in your toolkit, you know, going outside, movement, having people around me, alone time, good sleep, walking, breathing, support, looking at nature. You know, you have things you do. And so things you do are the strategies. But there are also strengths you call upon. So when strengths you call upon, if you kind of think, what's a difficult time you faced? And what were strengths that helped you do that? I'm going to invite you just to write in the chat window. When I just a strength that's helped me is, and you might think, you know, what are strengths that have helped me? I'm really grateful for my sense of humor. That's a strength that's helped me. I'm really grateful to my kind of strength of reflecting. I write a lot when I'm struggling, and so that's a really important strength. So again, just reminding yourself, what's a strength I call upon? And strengths are like friends. You can turn to them in times of need. But then resources, and this is important here, because when we look at resources, we're looking particularly at what do we turn to outside ourselves. And that can include nature. It include places around us that are a very important resource. It can also include people, can also include organizations like Norfolk and Waveney Mind, can also include people, you know, people that we go to for help, but it can also include websites on the internet or self-help books or pictures or pets are an important resource. And then insights are the ideas that guide us, the ideas that really make a difference. And so we think of this is our resilience toolkit. These are different things that we can give our attention to. And one of the questions I love to ask people, if we had a bit more time, I say, what are your favorite resilience tools? And in the second part of this session, after the break, we'll have a time we can have a breakout room, we can reflect on how our water levels are doing, but also what are some of the upward arrows? What are some of our favorite tools? It's such an important conversation to be able to hear that from each other. So I'm going to move on. So that was our first route, which is about skills and about skillfulness. And in that, one of the important skills was mapping resilience factors, drawing a little line like the water level, saying, how's my water level doing? What's pushing it down? What's pushing it up? But also one of the things that can push it up, in fact, research shows this is one of the most important. When there's disasters happen, people go through very difficult life experiences. One of the most important predictors of things going well is their social connectedness, when we have trusting relationships, people around us. And so I think of relationships as a bit like a spider's web. That spider's web is kind of, you need many strands, and as well as different levels of support. I think it's also to remember that we can support ourselves, but we don't want to only do that, that we also want to draw support from other people too. And also the context around us, just even like the street we live in. And that's something, these are things that we can change, with just something like planting a tree. And you can build relationship with a tree in a way that becomes part of your supportive context. And also, I think of our deeper root system, what we feel part of, what we feel we belong to. And a great question, if we're looking at relationships and we're looking at support, is if you were supporting a friend, or it might be a member of your family or a colleague, or if you're involved in teaching, might be someone you teach, or a fellow, whoever it is. If you want to support them, how might you do that? I'm going to ask for your top tips now. I'm going to ask you to write in the chat window some of your favorite ways of supporting people, and perhaps also ways that you like to be supported by others. I feel supported when people listen to me, for example, when people take me seriously, when people actually give me some time rather than being too busy. So I'm going to ask you just to write. Okay, so so you're really good at this. I'm seeing you make a cuppa, listen. What a really great bunch of listeners you are, and chocolate as well. Yes, thank you. These are ways that we support each other. I'm really getting a sense that, but it's making time, isn't it? Asking how they feel, make tea, coffee, listen. So now what's really interesting here is, of the things that you've written, create a safe space, how many of these can you also do to yourself? I love that question, because it reminds me that actually sometimes I'm better at supporting others than I am at supporting myself. I don't know how many other people that's true, but also listen was the one that got the biggest level of support. And I wonder, like, how do you listen to yourself? Do you have ways of doing that? I do. I write every day, and there's very good research that shows that expressive writing is a proven well-being strategy, that really impressive, that actually people with arthritis, when they write regularly about how they feel, some kind of journal, they actually get less symptoms of arthritis. And it's, and again, with any of these, I love what I call the buffet meal model, where you kind of put a lot of options out on the table, but what works really well for one person might not work for someone else. So I can see that Melanie, like me, does morning pages, and a great fan of that, but also that might not be the right thing for someone else. But it's worth thinking, well, okay, if not that, what else do I do to listen to myself? And I think when we talk about relationships, one of the most important relationships is with ourselves, and we can improve our relationship with ourselves by thinking about, okay, how do I speak to myself? How do I listen to myself? But how do I speak to myself? And you can speak to yourself from different places. And one of my questions I love is, what does the kind voice say? If you were to speak to yourself in a kind voice, what does the kind voice say? And what does the kind voice encourage you to do? I could ask that question every day. I quite often forget, but when I remember, I find it orientating and improving my relationship with myself. But also, what's important here too is to remember who else is around. And one of the practices that I invite people to do is just to do what I call support network mapping, where you just put your name in the middle, and then you have little put names around who else is around in your life, who's important source of either someone you give support to or receive support from. And if you give support to them, you just draw an arrow from you to them. And if you receive support from them, you put an arrow from them to you. Now, this might be something that you do at some point. You probably don't have time to do it now, but this might be something you come back to. You think, okay, if I want to take on as a project improving my support network, say, who's there? Where's the flow of energy in and out? Who do I support? Who do I feel supported by? And the most durable types of support are the ones that go both ways. But also, depending on your circumstance, situation, where you are, but thinking, okay, who can I draw in? But also, who's important here? And how can I improve my relationship with them? And you can actually apply the boat and water level to relationships as well as personal resilience. You can say, if the well-being or the satisfaction level in a relationship is like the water level, how can I raise that? How can I raise that? How can I give attention to that? I want to move on. This is really just a talk. We'll have opportunity to have some questions in the second part and also to try some of this out. But if we're looking at 3 routes, but also 3 pathways to resilience, one is about skills. There are skills that we can develop. 2 is about relationships. We can just give them time. You mentioned one of the most important things is listening, but also just giving time and considering and say, how can I give this some nourishment, these relationships, see them as important. But also one of our most important relationships is also with nature, with what's around us. And research shows that spending time in nature is a powerful contributor to resilience. And it's interesting here that they've done research where, say, for example, people in hospital having a gallbladder operation, if they look out a window and see trees, they get better more quickly and they take less painkiller tablets than if they're looking out onto concrete. That I think of it as the nature nurture effect, that when we have contact with nature, it nurtures us. And obviously you can have contact with nature in different ways, but I think even something as simple as looking out a hospital window, they've done research also with people in prisons, and if they are able to even just look out and see just a few blades of grass from their prison cell, they tend to pay less visits to the health services in that prison. Has an impact on their general well-being. Very good research that spending time with nature, and including something as simple as a 5-minute walk in nature every day, can have a measurable impact on our well-being. And if it's a bit longer and deeper, actually has not just in terms of our mood, but actually our memory improves more when we walk through nature than say like a park. If we walk through a park and we walk down a busy street, exercise through a park has a positive effect on our memory as well as our mood. Really interesting stuff. Now, I love this question. What do we feel part of? What do we draw strength from? Where do we take refuge? And what we're looking here is, it's amazing, when you look at a tree, there's almost as much below the ground as there is above. And that's what gives trees resilience, that they're able to hold themselves in place even when you have really huge gusty winds. And it's where they draw in their nourishment and they draw in their water. And we like that too. We need, as almost as if we kind of think of us saying, well, where's my root system? What am I rooted in? And how can I give attention to my roots? And I'm going to do a practice with you now. And I call it the special place practice. And some people say, well, look, I live in the middle of a big city. There is no nature near me. How can I connect with nature? And what's really interesting is that when we picture something in our minds, we actually get similar things going on in our brain as if we were actually there. And so, for example, people looking at pictures that are beautiful actually get a stimulation of the part of the brain associated with happiness. And if they're in pain, actually helps their pain control, just looking at beauty. And so we can do this. We can do this right now. I'm going to ask you to think of a favorite place in nature. Perhaps it's somewhere you've been. Perhaps it's somewhere you regularly go. Perhaps it's somewhere you used to go years and years ago and you haven't been there, but it's somewhere where you feel safe. And it's somewhere that you feel nourished by, you can draw strength from. And also, if you haven't got something that comes up in your memory, I'm going to invite you to imagine a place. Imagine a place. And I'm going to invite you, might want to, and this is really just an invitation and an offering. You can go along with it as much or as little as you'd like to. Seeing some people thinking of their garden, of bluebell woodlands, wherever it is for you. Invite you to, you can close your eyes if you like, or kind of half close them. But if you close your eyes, it's easier to imagine that you are there right now. Taking yourself to a special place in nature where you feel safe, you feel nourished, you can draw strength from. And what I'm going to invite you to do is look around you there and just notice, what colors do you see? What shapes do you see? And can you hear anything? What sounds would you hear if you were there right now? Actually picturing yourself there, how you'd feel if you were there, what you'd see if you were there, but also what you'd hear. What you'd hear. And maybe even what you'd smell. Maybe if there's a flower nearby, you might lean over and give it a sniff. And I'm going to invite in the idea that this is something that you can do anytime you want to, finding a time and a place so you won't be disturbed, and just taking a moment to tap into your root system. This is nature connecting. And that there may be places that you can go to physically, and each time you do that, to kind of pay special attention, say, I might come back here in my mind sometime. So you might take what I call mental snapshots. You might kind of pay special attention to what you're seeing, some of the details, and say, I'm going to remember this place because this is somewhere I can come back to anytime. Find a time and a place I won't be disturbed. And this can become a source of strength, be part of our root system. Now, I'm aware of time, and I'm going to suggest that we know that you can come back to this place, but I'm going to invite you to bring your attention back to the webinar. Bring your attention back to the webinar, and also just notice how you feel. You might write in the chat window if there's any impact, how you felt going to a place like that, if you did feel a place like that. Sometimes people can find it very easy to imagine themselves somewhere, and sometimes it's much more difficult, or there's things in the way. But this is a skill. This is a skill that we can get better at. And one of the things with these modern mobile phones is that you can actually record yourself talking yourself through something like this, or there's a recording of this. You can take the recording of this. There's visualizations you can get on your mobile phone. I've got one that if I wake in the night, I listen to it, and it guides me into this beautiful forest. That's one of my special places, and there's a waterfall there, and I kind of wash all the kind of worries and stresses away and bathe in this pool. And it's a wonderful thing to do, and it becomes a resource that I can turn to. So I'm seeing that, Rob, you feel calmer. Nick, you feel warm and fuzzy. And Nigel, you saw jagged rocks and ponies and streams. And and also, I want to really acknowledge that it's not always easy. And sometimes you kind of think, I can't do this. It's a struggle and it's a frustrating. And I don't know if you can ride a bicycle or remember the times when you first tried. That often skills are more difficult at first, and sometimes you can get better at them. I find what helps me is listening to someone else talking. It's easier to do that than to do it myself. And so that's try. But I think also there are many routes to self-steadying, and this is just one of them. So I'm going to draw to a close, and what I'm going to ask is, what are you taking away? What are you taking away from this session? Is there anything that's landed? Is there anything that makes sense to you? But also, are there any questions that you'd like to ask? And I'm going to suggest at this stage, you just write them in the chat window. We'll probably have more of a chance to hear from each other after the break. I just wanted to introduce this story pattern of resilience, that there's a downslope followed by an upslope. And actually, it's not as simple as that, because life is much more of a roller coaster with constant ups and downs. But when we have a down, what can we do that makes an upslope more likely, even if just a small one? And that's there are skills that help that happen. And that we already have things that we do that we probably find make a difference. So it's remembering for ourselves what's helped me in the past, but also, how would I find out more? How would I find out more? Just to say, someone enjoying my blue background, and just to say, this is just along the road for me. I live in the north east of Scotland, and it's not always like this, but I do have trees around me, and blue sky, and geese flying over them. So in terms of what you're taking away, Wendy, I'm saying you're seeing that one of the things you're taking away is that the SSRI, and particularly this idea of strategies, strengths, resources, and insights. Actions we can take, choices we can make, can have an antidepressant effect. And I see there's a question about from Jenny about resilience versus adaptation. And I have a system where I talk about different types of bounce ability. So resilience is often talked about as bouncing back. Oh, by the way, if you want to hear more about bouncing back, I've got a free online course. There's actually a website at resiliencetraining.net. And if you go to resiliencetraining.net, I've also got another website, collegeofwellbeing.com. But at resiliencetraining.net, there's a few different resilience courses, but there's a free one. It's called Resilience Tools for Free in a Time of Coronavirus Crisis. And I know that that's still around. There's maybe other types of crisis around too. But I talk people through a more in-depth storyboarding process, and some of the tools that we've looked at here. But I also look at 4 types of bounceability, and this ties to the question of what's resilience, what's adaptation. And I think the bouncing back is where I have a problem, I dip down, but then I return to where I was. But also sometimes I'm a bit more, rather than bouncing back, it's more, the image I have in my mind is more like a cork bobbing on the ocean. And it doesn't so much bounce back, but it bounces with the waves. It goes up and down with the waves. And so that even if there's a storm, the cork has a buoyancy that keeps it afloat. So it rises and falls with the waves rather than is sunk by them. And so I think of that as bouncing with, and I think of that's adaptive resilience. It's about adapting to things, working along with things, whereas recovery resilience is about returning back to where we were. And then bouncing forward is, I think of the idea of a transformative dip. where Heather's already mentioning this, really learning from a situation, the idea of post-traumatic growth, or there's another lovely term, adversity activated development, where we're actually strengthened by our experience of difficulty. But there's a fourth type of bounce, and it's really why we're here today. I think of it as bouncing outwards. And it's about how we can play a role in putting out ripples that support resilience in other people and other systems too. And we receive a lot from nature, but nature's under attack at the moment by humans. There's a mass extinction event happening. And so bouncing outwards is saying, how can I support resilience of other people and other systems, other living beings outside myself? And I think that and this is what I mean by the me, you and us model, that we're support resilience in ourselves, support resilience in other people, but we also support resilience in the larger systems that we're part of. It's a great story that we can be part of, that we can play our role in, that we can contribute to.